Inflation, the global dollar, and what comes next. This year has been fraught with concern about inflation. In March, economist Lawrence Summers issued an early warning flare, arguing that government coronavirus pandemic relief payments supported by debt could overheat the economy. Summers were vindicated this summer by Consumer Price Index statistics, which included 5.4% annualized CPI increase in June. Inflation frightens people for a variety of reasons, including the degradation of salaries' buying power and the value of dollar-denominated debt. However, in May, a famous foreign exchange trader named Stanley Druckenmiller warned of an even more serious long-term risk of inflation, that it might jeopardize the US dollar's place as the world's primary reserve currency. The US dollar is the most widely used currency in international trade. For example, the vast majority of global oil transactions is priced and settled in dollars. In addition, the dollar is the most extensively held foreign currency by central banks. This results in significant economic benefits for Americans, what has come to be described as the dollar's exorbitant privilege, and its collapse could harm the US economy. We're still a long way from the kind of hyperinflation that can devastate a currency or an economy. Argentina, for example, is currently experiencing 50% inflation. There is also a lot of evidence that current US inflation is heavily concentrated in a few areas, and bond investors have remained steadfastly dubious of inflation forecasts. Whether or not inflation accelerates things, it is apparent that the dollar's reserve role is already under threat. The dollar's proportion of global reserves fell to a 25-year low in May. Since 1999, the dollar's share has fallen from over 71% to just under 60%. And the competition is only getting fiercer. The Eurozone has begun to issue debt, which might make it a more viable reserve currency. China has spent more than a decade attempting to make its currency more accessible to international investors, including, some claim, by creating a central bank digital currency, CBDC. El Salvador's use of Bitcoin as legal cash suggests that a digital currency or other exotic instrument may become part of the equation. So, what is causing the drop, and why may inflation hasten it? How significant would the impact on the US be if the dollar continued to fall? And how viable are the major contenders for the dollar's throne? What exactly is a reserve currency? Reserve status is no longer an official title in the 21st century, but rather a competitive position based on whose currency is most trustworthy and helpful for global trade. As a result, the main reserve currency might shift. Prior to World War I, it was the British pound. According to economist Barry Eichengreen of the University of California, Berkeley, the dollar continued to acquire dominance when the United States sold weaponry to fighters throughout World War II, increasing its gold reserves. This shift also reflects the general trend that leading global trading nations have dominating global currencies. Businesses and governments needed to keep American currency in order to purchase American goods, and the United States remained the major worldwide manufacturer for decades following World War II. Some countries also keep a variety of currencies on hand to help stabilize the global value of their own currency. If the pound falls against the yen, for example, the Bank of England may sell yen from its reserves in an attempt to bring prices back down. This is the basic mechanism that algorithmic stablecoins try to mimic. However, exchange rate policy has altered significantly during the last century, and fewer countries currently maintain official currency pegs that necessitate considerable reserves. However, utility for trade and currency pegging are insufficient to constitute a reserve currency. Because it was trusted, in part because it was backed by gold under the Bretton Woods Agreement, the dollar came to account for an increasing share of foreign central bank holdings. After the abolition of the gold standard in 1971, the dollar held its dominance not only because of US economic power, but also because of trust in the US government's stability and economic policies. The absence of credible alternatives to the dollar, on the other hand, has been critical to its prolonged dominance. That may still be the best defense it has today. Why might the dollar lose its role as a reserve currency? There are at least 4 headwinds that could endanger, or at the very least impair, the dollar's status as a worldwide reserve currency. They are fiscal weakness, the national debt, monetary weakness, inflation, political instability, and structural issues with the Treasury bond market. The vast majority of international reserves are held in the form of bonds, which are a type of borrowing. That means a country's reserve status is contingent on its ability to repay such debts. According to Stanford University economist and bond market expert Darrell Duffy, repayment is a long-term concern for the United States and the dollar, but not for the next few years or even the next few decades. Inflation is, at the very least, a more immediate concern. One key belief that aided the dollar's rise to reserve status was that the United States would not begin producing money indiscriminately, fearing that dollar inflation would destroy the value of dollar-denominated international holdings. The French franc lost its reserve status in the 1960s, when the French government was forced to manufacture money to cover the costs of the Algerian Revolution. While the bond market has so far ignored the possibility of inflation, a truly irresponsible administration might quickly switch it on. However, Eichengreen contends that there are numerous variables more crucial than low inflation for a dominating reserve currency. The importance of economic eminence explains the long-term drop in dollar reserves. Because of the emergence of Japan, Mexico, Korea, China, Brazil, and many other countries as productive centers, more of their currencies are now circulating as trade instruments around the world than in the mid-20th century. The United States today produces slightly more than 10% of all global exports, making the dollar less and less helpful for commerce. However, it remains a singularly powerful economy, which appears to explain why US bond markets haven't cratered in response to inflation fears. The ongoing demand for treasuries indicates the conviction that a rise in debt spending now would help to shore up the US economy in the long run, and that it is a worthwhile trade-off for some inflation risk. The transparency and dependability of financial systems themselves are also critical. This comprises a stable set of financial laws as well as organizations that can quickly convert bonds or other financial instruments into cash. There was a scare on this front last March, when the commencement of the pandemic sparked panicky selling of US treasuries, causing treasury markets to collapse. According to Duffy, the good news is that this was a market structure issue connected to bank reserve requirements, rather than a lack of demand for US treasuries. However, he believes that resolving issues in the treasury market is critical to the dollar's long-term health. Buyers like treasuries because they can be liquidated quickly, he explains. The fear that the market would fail could affect the price at which the treasury can sell bonds in the first place. Finally, currency domination requires political stability, trust, and transparency. This is a persistent hurdle to Chinese yuan adoption, but it is also a growing concern for the United States, given what some regard as trade animosity, mounting unrest, and anti-democratic attempts by some US political groupings. The good news is that most of the challenges to the dollar are either gradual or far off in the future. There is no major risk of dollar displacement in the short run, says Yahya Fanyusi, a former CI analyst and adjunct senior fellow for currency issues at the Center for a New American Security, CNAS. Still, if and when enough of these fundamentals fail, the globe might soon abandon the dollar. There is an idea that a reserve currency benefits from incumbency, or what the IT sector refers to as network effects. But history reminds us that those impacts are scarcely decisive. The US dollar first surpassed the British pound in international finance in 1925, barely 10 years after the Federal Reserve was established in 1914. Why would losing reserve status be detrimental to the United States? It is not easy to run a worldwide reserve currency. According to US Treasury economist Kenneth Austin, reserve status affects the US economy, particularly manufacturing, by making US exports more expensive. However, the current consensus is primarily focused on several important benefits that the United States and its inhabitants enjoy from the dollar's reserve status. Some are convenience issues, such as the ability of US travelers to pay in dollars anywhere in the globe, or the simplicity with which US corporations can manage invoicing and exchange rate risk. Other benefits, though, are far-reaching. The most dramatic example is what is known as seigniorage, or the willingness of foreign governments to trade $100 worth of real products and services for a $100 bill that only costs the US Mint a few cents to make. The same can be said for Treasury bonds. This results in some very amazing effects. There is around $500 billion in US cash in circulation worldwide, as well as approximately $7 trillion in US government bonds. Those ledger entries were supplied in exchange for items like Chinese-made goods, which have immediate material effects on American quality of life. This is an asymmetric financial system, according to Icahn Green, with the international community supporting American living standards and subsidizing American multinationals. This is justifiable in theory. Both dollars and bonds can be used to buy products from America. Both bills and bonds are essentially debts. However, the dollar's reserve currency position restricts this backflow because it is maintained as a long-term store of value. Bonds can be held in foreign banks for decades if they remain trustworthy. Meanwhile, the $500 million or more in US cash floating around the world is just as likely to be used for transactions with third countries as it is to return home and make a claim on goods. So the United States has purchased around $7.5 trillion in products and services at a fire sale price. As the dollar's reserve status deteriorates, this flood will not only slow, but may even reverse. As we've seen with the dollar's dropping share, this would most likely be a protracted process with incremental implications. However, a bank run is also a possibility. If the dollar suffers a big shock, say, on the scope of a second American Civil War, foreign governments would move fast to exchange dollar bonds for superior assets from US firms. There is nothing that can be done to halt this until currency controls are implemented, which would effectively eliminate reserve status. A boisterous unwinding of the dollar would be disastrous. However, such a collapse would most likely occur only after circumstances so devastating that reserve status would be the last thing on our minds. For France in the 1960s, the death knell was out-of-control expenditure motivated by a desperate attempt to preserve the final vestiges of its empire. It was a full-fledged Nazi attack for England in the 1940s. However, unless things were already extremely disorganized in the United States, a gradual drop in the dollar's relative importance would not cause disorder or impoverishment. Seigniorage is good, but the $7.5 trillion gained by the United States from it over several decades is just roughly one-third of the country's yearly GDP. Seigniorage, according to Icahn Green, is merely the 23rd most important determinant in America's worldwide economic standing. The United States also benefits from very low borrowing costs as a result of the dollar's reserve status, which reduces interest payments on all those bonds by hundreds of billions of dollars per year. The US government can even borrow at a rate that is 2 to 3 percentage points lower than what it receives from its own foreign assets. However, if there is less demand for dollars, borrowing will become more expensive. That could be the most serious threat to domestic economic security in the United States, because losing reserve status would significantly diminish government money available for domestic spending. Finally, the dollar provides the United States with certain intangible benefits in terms of geopolitical strength. The current quo for US national economic security is that we have enormous leverage, Fanussi argues. We can use sanctions and other means to enforce policy interests. While it is difficult to place a monetary value on the force of international sanctions, it is clear that it is a tool that US political leaders do not want to lose. What happens next? Global currencies are effectively competing for usage in trade and reserves, with convertibility and stability being the most important indicators. After World War II, the dollar's reserve position was largely retained by a lack of competition. The economies of France, England, and Germany were literally reduced to rubble, and a series of devaluations tied to rebuilding efforts and imperial decline severely damaged faith in the pound and franc. The landscape has changed dramatically. The euro, yen, and yuan all have characteristics that make them attractive global reserves, and China, in particular, has been aggressively pursuing more international yuan flows for at least a decade. The development of the digital yuan, for example, has been widely perceived in the West as part of that effort. Nonetheless, despite occasional falls, the dollar has maintained its reserve and trading dominance. For the time being, analysts believe that each of the prospective dollar competitors has some fatal flaw that makes it less desirable. Japan, for example, retains the majority of its debt domestically, rendering it ineligible for reserve holdings. China's domestic policy objectives clash with its reserve ambitions. In an upcoming companion essay, we'll go into the advantages and disadvantages of rival fiat currencies in greater depth. We will also investigate the potential of a new type of reserve option, cryptocurrency. When El Salvador proclaimed its intention to hold Bitcoin as a worldwide reserve currency, the concept of Bitcoin as a global reserve currency gained traction, though not explicitly as a reserve. Cryptocurrency offers certain enticing reserve qualities, including as openness and liquidity. Even more tempting may be the fact that a true crypto, such as Bitcoin, would remove monetary management decisions, as well as the potential to abuse them, from the hands of any single country. The concept of crypto reserves is fresh and unusual, and it would entail a slew of obstacles, uncertainty, and structural changes, all of which will be discussed in the accompanying piece. However, cryptocurrency has more validity in conventional economics than you may think. Former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney has proposed a synthetic reserve currency based on crypto-like technologies, while Forex giant Stanley Druckenmiller believes crypto will be the next major reserve currency. Time will tell, but I wouldn't rule anything out just yet. We hope you enjoyed watching and listening to this video. Please let us know your opinion in the comments area below. If you found our content useful, please like it and share it with your friends. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more crypto-related contents.